Try that again, this time with a microphone on. Good morning. Welcome back. My name is Trey Gallaher, and this is my stream. Thanks for joining this morning or this afternoon or this evening or wherever you are. Thanks for coming and joining. Hope you're having a good one wherever you are. We're going to be continuing part 3 of Dragon Tower here, which last time we sort of applied some watercolor over the top of the drawing, kind of get a general tone set. And I think that for today, we are going to do bits of highlights and kind of more polishing, and hopefully getting this thing to a little bit more of a close. So I hope you can stay for a while, maybe pull up a pencil and draw with me. Or if you got some work you got to do, keep me on in the background. I love having you along for the ride, and let's share some time together. I hope whatever you're doing out there, you're able to do your passions and keep those passions fueled and moving forward. Let's check a little stream health here. Looks like we're good. Everything seems pretty solid. Gotta love that morning coffee, right? That first one is a great one. Usually when I'm doing this in the evening, I'm having tea, but this morning we are doing coffee. A must. Gotta have the morning coffee. And for those of you that know me, you know my coffee is my coffee. So last time when we were working with watercolor, we were working with some Holbeins, and I generally like Holbein colors for sort of the water soluble, but I also like Winsor and Newton. But this time for today for gouache, I exclusively like Holbein when it comes to my gouache. I think when I'm working in gouache, I like things a little brighter, a little poppier, and Holbein's gouaches are really nice and rich and colorful, and have a real brightness to them. So there might be a little bit of a palette shift, but I'll be working to try to obviously keep harmony in the piece so that I don't have any strange colors coming in that weren't predicted. So I'm sort of merging a watercolor palette and a gouache palette, but they're not too far off from the same maker, so the colors will probably be similar. I'm probably going to be putting in some opaques, so I'll be using probably a lot of white. And in gouache, you tend to get a little bit more of that chalk base that's added to a water-soluble medium. I mean, gouache and watercolor are very similar. Gouache has sort of a chalky additive, which makes it opaque and not transparent. And you can get thick with it, which is why it's kind of a fun oil painter's graphic medium. And that it can be used thickly and opaquely, but thinned down it can be also be used very much like water, but in order to, or watercolor. But in order to get the opacity, you have to work a little thicker, drier, and with the addition of white. So I don't know if you can see, this is sort of some gouache white. Here we go. Maybe you could see there. I don't know. So this is sort of some Holbein gouache white. Thought that would work. Thought that would show. Well, doesn't even need my hand there. Look at that. Focus! So I'm going to be adding this to a lot of what are my otherwise gouache-based colors. I'll show you. I like the Holbeins. So yeah. So, but selectively adding gouache, mostly for highlights, because what I'm finding here is that I didn't preserve enough of the highlights in the sort of spontaneous painting that we were doing last time that I knew I would, protect certain whites. If you're going to work in watercolor specifically, you want to keep those areas preserved that are going to be white, like bright white, and you wouldn't put paint over them. But if you're working in mixed medium, or say a little gouache or colored pencil over the top of your watercolor, you can bring some of that white back in if need be. And this really wasn't that planned out of a watercolor painting. It's not that tactical, a little more spontaneous. So I am going to use a little bit of gouache to get my concept to come back out. So should have fun today. Hope you can stay for a while. And looking forward to having you stick along. Stay with me as long as you can. All right, so let's see. Looking at this now. Also, I'm working in gouache. One additional thing I'd like to mention. When I'm switching over to gouache, I generally switch over to using flats. And when you're working with opaque paint, it involves generally a little more rigid dry brushing and scrubbing, and you need a little more firmness. So I tend to switch over to a flat brush. Now this is not an expensive brush. This is a relatively inexpensive brush, but it's good sort of mixed media flat or bright. So I'll be using a bit more of those rather than the pointed watercolor brushes, or rounds, which you would use more classically that we did last time, something like this. Something a little bit more of a round tip to it. Gouache can be pretty hard on your brushes because there's a lot of scrubbing and a lot of medium getting in there that's dry and probably affecting the bristles. So I am switching to these other brushes also because I want to keep my watercolor bristles really nice. And if you take care of your watercolor brushes, they can last for years. I've had a set of watercolor brushes here for over 20, 25 years. And if you take good care of them, they last, right? And they're generally are a natural hair brush or some combination of natural and synthetic. But when it comes to gouache, they get beat up a lot. So you can use the more inexpensive brushes for that. Anyway, excuse me. Got a little morning crud. Sorry about that. All right. So where do we pick up from last time? Is there anywhere that needs a little bit more definition, maybe a little cleanup before we dive into the highlights? I'm looking at, I have a few scratches and stuff that happen over here. Big deal. Could probably take it out with Photoshop. If I want to sell this piece, then perhaps I might want to clean it up so it just looks a little more presentable. There's a few spots up in here which I might want to clean up. I'm thinking about the roof of the house, or the castle over here, this sort of thatched pointed roof, or shingled roof, I should say. I got a little bit too wide, so I need to knock back some of these areas sort of up in here. So I'll clean up a few edges. That's the first thing I'm seeing. Obviously stuff in the margins. I don't mind this kind of thing because it's sort of part of the original drawing. That doesn't bother me. I'll be obviously working some highlights on the dragon here. Little bits of edge that will also sort of simultaneously create a lot of contrast for my shadows. I don't think I'm going to go into the shadows a whole lot more. I think the goal here is to stay in that upper 20% value range where I'm mostly towards the lights. I want to let the shadows kind of drift and become part of the texture, but if I need a highlight because I need to see some form, I might do that. I'm thinking here along the edges of the this little turret here, this little shielding block. I think it needs a little highlight because it's getting lost into the background. Maybe a little bit more light here. I could scrub back in as well versus using gouache, which I might do. I might keep the gouache closer to the dragon's texture Because one other thing that highlights are going to add to this is highlights are going to bring in texture. And I want the focus to be on the dragon, not so much the tower. So if I go in with dry medium or a gouache over the top, I want to keep that to the highlights, which is going to be communicating the texture. So maybe in the tower, but I know mostly the textural highlights I'll be adding will be to the dragon. And then, of course, patching up and fixing a few other things. And, you know, just here and there as I see fit. So let's get it rolling. I'm working on a little palette here off to the side, which you can't see, which I guess would be sort of over here. Behind me, I have a little palette. I'm working right-handed, so off to that side. And I have a couple, by the way, you can't really see it, but I usually keep 2 water jars for warms and cools. So I kind of have they're a little bit bigger than this. This is my drinking glass. But they're very similar to this, and they're off to the right, and I have one for warm and one for cool. Because if you start mixing complementary colors and warms and cools a lot, you're going to end up muddying your water a lot sooner. So I want to have enough water that I don't have to go out for a change while we're streaming. Not a big deal if you need to, but I don't want to have to get up. So I'm giving myself plenty of water to work with. All right. So let's try a little bit of cleanup first. And I'm pretty much going in, this is just straight white right here, because I just want to get this edge kind of cleaned up. And I might have to revisit this edge a couple times too. Gouache tends to dry pretty flat, which makes it a really good sort of editing medium. I think I'll take this guy out too. It's almost like a correction fluid, but correction fluid is weird. It has this strange property to it that dries and cracks, and it doesn't age well. So, you know, if you really want to do edits and you know, using opaque white, you should use opaque white. The other product that I sometimes use is not so much on paintings, but more on inking, is I use Dr. Martin's bleed-proof white, which is pretty good stuff if you're just editing, you know, inking related things. But if it's paint, I try to use an opaque gouache, which is pretty much the same stuff. So it cleans up my edge there a little bit, and that's good. All right. So I'm going to need a little bit of a finer brush. The other nice part about gouache is that even if it dries on you, you can go back in and get it wet again and work a little bit more with it. Now in this case, I'm going to move away from the flats and go a little bit more into this round guy here. Got my buddy with me today. You doing all right? You doing all right, buddy? Got a little bit of the edge of my castle roof. Just a little more definition. So I'm going to start in on this dragon here. I want to get a little light on there. I don't necessarily want to use pure white though, unless it's truly a white light. But I get the feeling this is a little bit more of a warm sunsetting light. So pure bright white will not make sense on there. So I'm going to probably need to tone this down a little bit with some maybe orange a little bit, like a cadmium orange. So I got a little bit going over here. See how this looks. Oop. Now you got to figure that the skin is somewhat darker, sort of a dark bluish color, and blue with the orange is going to make complementary relationship. So we're talking about something that's going to be kind of neutralized. So maybe warmer brown. See what I got here. I think I have a little burnt sienna. One of my favorite colors of all time, burnt sienna. I'm going to drop a little bit of that over here. Let's see how that looks. Too much. Too strong. I might end up actually getting very close to the color that's there, but it will look more opaque than the sort of washed out translucent white that's there. So what you're seeing here is a combination of the natural mixing of light, which is the warm wash over a cool body, right? Which is neutralizing and giving us a little bit of this kind of neutralized white in here, but instead of it being transparent and not very opaque and bright, I want to use almost the same kind of combination of colors, but brightening them up a little bit. So it's it's very similar to what's there. Let me give myself a little more room over here. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're working on part 3 of Dragon Tower, going back in with some gouache this morning and trying to bring out a little bit of the highlights and a little bit of the textures for the focus. Last time we blocked in with some watercolor, and this time we're coming back in with some highlights. If you're just joining, welcome. Pull up a pencil, draw with, or if you got some work you're doing, maybe keep me on in the background while you're doing your work. And I'm glad to have you along. I hope you're doing well this afternoon. So as I'm doing these highlights here, I'm paying a little bit of attention to temperature of the highlights. I'm picturing a bit of a warmer light coming in from the side, and instead of just going in pure white, I'm actually toning it down just a little bit, giving a little bit of color of the light source in it. But again, this is one of those things where the light source, which is warm, is in contrast and complementary to the color of the object. So what happens when you mix two complements is you get a neutral, could be brownish gray. So it might not be the most colorful highlight in the world, but it has to be bright enough to communicate the light source, but quickly gonna temper off into the complementary color of the what we would call the local. The color of the object is the local. This is kind of the fun part. You know, if you stage a painting right, applying the little speculars and the highlights and the textures is the most fun part. Because you've done all the staging, all the groundwork has been done, so you can really just kind of enjoy putting things down, and it can be almost kind of a spontaneous process, and it's just a lot of fun. But it is the groundwork that makes it possible. So you got to do the base layers to set yourself up. So I'm going a little bit thicker up here to kind of get over my pencil a little bit. And I think some of this will be clarified. So one thing with gouache that you're dealing with is it dries pretty fast, so you're having to kind of keep it in this fluid state where you can paint with it. But if you're working kind of thinly and in small batches, it tends to dry fast. So you reactivate it by adding water, but then when you're adding a little bit of water, you're also diluting the opacity. So you're kind of working in this place where you're a little bit more pigment, a little bit more water, keep it in this wet finessing stage, and then so it's manipulatable. That's a big word. Um, and then that allows you to control it a little bit more, give it a little more viscosity, but it's a balance of adjusting more pigment, a little more water, keeping it wet. I'm not doing it today, but sometimes people work with gouache on like tissue paper or like a paper towel that's wet. It sort of helps keep it moist, the paint from drying on you. Um, I'm not doing that massive amounts of paint here, so I don't need to have big old tubes of paint. But if you do start working in larger quantities, you might want to put something like that down. Also, I don't tend to put out a lot of paint until I need it. It's kind of a waste. I know sometimes people, when they get started, they start globbing all kinds of paint down. But truthfully, this stuff's expensive, the good quality stuff. So little bit at a time. Going back over this now that it's dried a little bit, give it another layer. You have to wait for it to be good and dry, because gouache is very water soluble. So as you're working with it, it will. If you press too hard and get too much moisture there, it'll start coming back up on you, and that may not be what you're looking for. So I'm staying kind of thick and opaque with it as I'm touching up those areas. And we are getting thunderstorms today in California, in San Francisco, which we don't get very often, and especially in the summertime. Had a spell of hot weather, and then suddenly this front came in, and we're getting a lot of thunderstorms outside. Sounds cool. All right. So we're getting a little bit more highlight on my beastie here, and that's looking pretty good. Pretty happy with that. Maybe a little more on the feet down here, I guess. So back over here on this side, I'm going to do a little bit of a little reflected light back over here just to make this hand kind of pop. Just a little bit. So you see it and you're reminded that that hand is, that claw, that talon is reaching around the other side there. come back up here on this part. The nice part about gouache is it's water soluble, so you can push back in here a little bit. Just using a little bit of water and lifting back up there. Gotta let it get good and dry. All right, so let's do another check against ourselves just to see where we're at. Don't get too caught up in any one area. It's good to step back and kind of survey where you're at the moment and if there's anything else that sort of needs to happen. Another thing I like to do is I like to move around so that I don't get too noodling in one area. Keep moving. Keep moving. So that when you come back to another area, it's like you're revisiting it again. When you work in warm cools, I try to make my reflected light be the cooler light, although I guess it really does depend. But if the warmer light is the fill, or not the fill, but the spot, and the predominant light source is warmer, then the reflected would be cooler. So I don't know if you can really tell much difference here on screen, but I'm warming up my highlights that are over here. I'm using a white with a little bit of yellow orange in it, maybe just a titch, to keep it on the warmer side facing the light source. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work on some details of the castle, because I think in a few places I need to scrub in and bring out a little bit more highlight. A little bit more highlight in a few places, because like on these sort of little, if I'm using the right word, but turrets, or these little places where, say, people fending off attackers would stand behind here, you know, your arrow guys who would be shooting or defending from behind these things. This is going to be catching some light coming in from the side, so in order to make those forms pop, because right now they're getting a little lost in just the muddiness of the values, they need a little something to remind us that they're there up top, over here. And I'm going to do as much as I can without the gouache, and then we'll see if I need the gouache, because the opacity of the gouache is going to make it pop, and I don't know that I want that much pop, to be honest. So I'm going to scrub in a little bit here, and I'm using a flat that I use for gouache, and it's a little stiffer and good for doing lines as well. Then I'm going to soak it, press down here a little bit, and then lift. Yeah, and I don't think that's going to need much gouache, to be honest. I don't think it's going to need much more opacity to that. So I'm going to try that again. Maybe a little bit over in this guy here. Kind of scrubbing, a little bit of back and forth, pushing on it a little bit. That's why you need a bright or a flat. It's a little firmer. And then nice dry piece of tissue. Don't scrub it because you'll swipe the paint. You want to just dab straight down with some pressure, let it absorb, and get some light out of there. Now, you know, if that's too much, and I think that's actually a little too much, I have that paint in the bristles here, so if I just come back over it again with the paint that I just picked up, you know, I can quiet it down a little bit there. Okay, here we go over here. Same thing. I think this is going to have, I'm going to push in with some of these bricks shapes. A little bit on the vertical edge. Sometimes you can't even necessarily see 100% where you're pressing, but that's okay. It'll be all revealed when you lift out some of that paint there. All right. That's good. Scrubbing in on this back wall here. Scrub, 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 kind of pushing the paper a little bit. And you can see some of the pulp is coming up. Now, better watercolor paper would probably not get so pulpy. I'm kind of working on this. I think last time we were talking about it was illustration paper, which means it'll take a little bit of abuse, but it won't take a lot of abuse. But better watercolor paper would take better, would stand more than what this is. So again, working on some of these highlights. And again, I don't want them brighter than the dragon. Not to mention, if they're just stone, they won't be that bright anyway. But I'm getting a little bit. I don't think there's much more because I lifted last time, so I don't think there's a whole lot more in there. A little bit, a little back and forth scrub, a little dab. It's working pretty good. All right, let's see here. Got to come back up in here. A little dab. A little bit more. There's probably a cast shadow up here someplace from the edge of the roof, but the sun is low, so if the sun is low, then maybe not so much shadow underneath landing on the edge of that thing. Just want a feeling of that structure. By the way, you can't continuously scrub back in. It just won't take it. after a certain time, it just won't take it. The paper gets too beat up, it's stained. And watercolor, good watercolor, stains, which is a good thing because its permanency and saturation is really high, but you won't be able to lift back to pure white. This is why watercolor purists and people working exclusively just watercolor who need that brightness need to preserve it. And you can use like gum arabic, which is kind of like rubber cement like stuff, which will protect your whites if you don't want to go back in with opaque white. But we're not that hardcore in this case. All things considered, I'm pretty happy here. Really important that you have like dry absorbent paper when you're lifting. But it's got to be kind of durable too, so a good paper towel brand, and it doesn't work once it's damp. It's got to be really dry. Dry. Looking pretty good here. I might need a little bits of tone in a few places. Of course, when you lift, you're also pulling out some of the density of the darker values or drawing that may be underneath. It may start to come up and not have as much contrast. So you got to be a little bit careful of that. And then again, you have some of the same paint in the brush, which you can put back down. So I think one of the things I'm going to start doing now is I want to bring out maybe just a little bit of anatomy out of the shadows, because I have a pretty steep contrast here and I'm not getting any of the anatomy in the shadows, and that's to some degree that's okay. That works just fine. But I don't want it to be flat either. You know, good painting can get value subtlety even in the shadows. So it doesn't have to be hard edged, but it needs to suggest some sort of anatomy here. So I am going to use my ultra absorbent watercolor brush and kind of come in here with sort of a soft, damp brush and suggest a little bit of anatomy that might be here. And instead of using the paper, which will really soak it back up, I'm using the brush to soak it back up. There we go. So it leaves some behind. Sort of a little bit over here too. It's almost like you're reallocating where the pigment is. You're picking it up in some places, putting it back down in others. This is the fun of watercolor, is it is soluble. There's a little bit of the finesse game kind of happening in here. Not too much water. I don't want edges. I'm trying to keep it soft. Just a suggestion. Of maybe some sort of chest muscles going on here. Not too bright, just a little bit. It's almost like the first pass of water loosens it, and then the second pass picks it up a little bit. But use that paint. Don't let it get away, because it's the perfect value and color mix that you've been looking for. So if you can pick it up in the bristles, put it back down someplace else that you need it, where you need a little more definition. Kind of a nice soft finesse game. Picking a little bit of it up, putting it back down. Can always go down with more paint, but you got to mix the right amount of saturation and color to get back in there. I'm gonna pick up a little bit right here, like a little reflected light coming off of the building there, just a little bit. Not bad. I'm going to have to add a little bit more of my darker watercolor back in here. I think this was sort of a combo of some Payne's Gray, Dioxazine Violet. I need to get some contrast back in here. I might have to wait for this to dry actually, because I think it's just a little too wet. If your paper is too wet, you're going to get sort of wet into wet technique, which is a great technique for watercolor, but if you need more edge control, then you need to let some edges dry. Otherwise, you're just going to get softer and less controlled. Again, I'm sort of reallocating my values, pushing them around a little bit. So I've got this little area up here where I think I'm going to have to give it a little help. So lifting a little bit, reflected light, turning my forms, turning my edges a little bit. Lifting in a few places, putting value back down. It's very sensitive, so you don't want to accidentally drop water where you don't want it to be, not at this point. So I think at some point, one of the last things I will do, I don't know if it'll happen here on stream today, but I'll probably go back in and pop a few values out to make sure things that need edge will have edge. I'm still kind of waiting on this area to dry a little bit before I touch it again. All right, I'm going to go back to lifting out my edge over here on the castle, on that turret. So I'm going to get a fresh piece of paper. So I have a nice dry surface to lift, but I'm going to get a little bit more out of this over here, if I can lift it. It's been lifted once, I think, so I don't know how much I'm going to get. But I'm going to scrub a little bit, pushing in with those bristles on the surface. It'll look a little muddy now, but when I drop some paper down, I think it'll be okay. All right. Kind of worked there a little bit. I need to get some highlight on this edge too. So I'm going to do a little scrub. And this is going to be an interesting spot in here because there would probably be like another turret in there, and it's right along the edge of my castle, which I want to be nice and clearly defined. So I may have to do a little cleanup in here. This edge is not looking real clean. So I think first I'm going to hit this with a little bit of water. And if there's any, I'll try to get as much up of the paint as I can. But then I think I'm going to probably end up going back in here with white. It just needs a little bit of help. I think it got too muddy when I went down with the watercolor. And that's okay. And it's par for the course. So I'm letting those highlight areas dry a little bit up in here, and I'm going to try to darken a few things in now, just to get a little more contrast. It's really hard to go in and get contrast with if you don't want to add white. If you want to add white, then that's fine. But if you're trying to use less white or less opacity, then you could do it with contrast alone. So I think just to get a little more help in a few places, I'm going back in with a little shadowing around some edges just to deepen the contrast, which might inform how much highlight I really need on something. But I think I'm a little lacking in contrast in a few places, so I want to darken things up a little bit. So I'm coming back in with a little bit of line work for those really dark areas that are going to pop. Which I kind of lost, you know, before when I was doing my washes. Again, this is a tonal drawing, a tonal painting, so I'm not too concerned about wanting to like outline everything. I just need a little bit of contrast. So it's less to do with like actual line and more to do with contrasting values next to each other, which in this case is happening a little bit more on one edge and on the other edge, and then the middle becomes this sort of toned area with less definition. But that doesn't mean I want it to totally go away either. So if it needs a little help, we're really getting into the sort of touch-up phases now. So I'm kind of working with this sort of neutralized little dioxazine violet and viridian green. Sort of makes sort of a panes with a little titch maybe of burnt umber. So by simultaneous contrast, you start bringing in some darker edges and lines. It makes the highlights look brighter. And that's a good thing. I think this area might be ready for a little more shadow. Which in turn is going to pop this edge. A lot more. I suppose you could do this with a pencil too, if it's dark enough, but a pencil is going to put them, first of all, if it's graphite, that's not going to work because when the light hits the surface, the graphite is going to have a sheen to it that won't look very good. You could go in with like a Prismacolor. The Prismacolor might work. But again, you put a waxy surface down, it's going to repel water. So you have to be a little careful about what medium you put over the top, because once you do, anything with colored pencil will always be the top layer if it's like a Prismacolor. Now you could use watercolor pencil, I suppose. And that way, if you hit it with water again, it'll mix in. So if you stay in the same medium, then it's more mixable and adaptable with the medium that you're working in. Okay. Now I'm getting that dragon wing a little bit more in here. So ever so softly, I'm letting shapes blend into shapes, you know, the shadows in here kind of blending into the shadows in there. It's not so important that it's perfectly outlined. I think as long as it's giving a suggestion of what we're after. So that means more of your contrasty edges are going to be sort of up against the reflected light, both sides, but then the middle will be kind of this semi-dark valued area where everything just kind of blends in shadow.